You're listening to the Drawing the Ideal Self podcast, episode 50. Who would have thought we'd ever have 50 episodes? But here we still are. Today's episode is going to be about Kelly's definition of disorder. The inspiration for this came from a radio programme on BBC Radio 4 called The Age of Diagnosis by Suzanne O'Sullivan. It's an abridged version of a book she's written, and it is the book of the week. I think that was last week's book of the week, actually. So it's described as a thought-provoking new book from the neurologist and award-winning author Suzanne O'Sullivan, exploding conventional wisdom about medical diagnoses. This is an area which has, over time, caused me some consternation at the very least, and at times distress. I can remember the first child I was ever involved with diagnosed with ADHD. That was a really distressing experience because I knew that the outcome would be that he had medication. Actually, it worked well for him and made a massive difference to his life and his attainments, so it wasn't all bad. The reason that I got interested in really being involved with any kind of diagnosis was I was not happy with the way the system worked. I didn't like the way diagnosis seemed to stereotype people and write them off, or confine them to always having that diagnosis. And one of the useful things for me was to be able to go back to PCP from time to time and remind myself of what Kelly had to say. So that's what I'm going to do today. So this episode is going to really be about Kelly's explanation or description of disorder. And he starts with talking about this. Well, it goes through both of his major volumes, but a lot of this stuff is taken from volume 2 in chapter 16. So if you're interested, you can find that. I'm using the 1991 version rather than the 1955. So I will put the reference to that in the show notes, and I'll also put the reference to the radio programme in there. So what Kelly said about disorder is, our approach to psychological disturbance is altogether in terms of dimensions rather than in terms of entities. From the standpoint of the psychology of personal constructs, we may define a disorder as any personal construction which is used repeatedly in spite of consistent invalidation. This is an unusual definition as psychological thinking ordinarily goes. At first glance, it may seem as though we have cut the ground from under a major premise of psychology, that readjustment inevitably follows upon failure. But let us point out that we have not laid down such a premise. We have not said that invalidation necessarily causes a revision of one's personal construction of life. What we have assumed in this regard is carefully expressed in our organisation, experience, modulation and fragmentation corollaries. A personal construction system is an organised thing. The failure of one part of it does not necessarily lead immediately to a replacement of that part. Before replacing a part, the person is likely to take a look at his whole scaffolding to see how much useful structure is in the danger of collapsing. Thus, even an obviously invalid part of a construction system may be preferable to the void of anxiety which might be caused by its elimination altogether. We may approach the problem of what constitutes a disorder at a very simple and practical level. We may say simply that the goal of psychotherapy is to alleviate complaints of a person about himself and others, and the complaints of others about him. Some psychologists will not be very happy with this definition. Clinical psychologists are always being pressed to make some definitive statement of what ultimate value they pursue in their work. Such a statement would have to be pitched at the level of a religion or philosophy, not at the level of a system of psychology. He goes on to say, a word about our definition of the goal of psychotherapy is in order here. We said that the goal of psychotherapy is to alleviate complaints, but this does not mean either that the person who complains or the person who is complained about is necessarily the one to be worked over. Interesting use of language there. Um, and I apologise for all the hymns, but I'm taking it directly from Kelly. It goes on, the psychologist, as we have suggested before, turns his attention to that point which offers the greatest likelihood of producing results in the future. He does not necessarily turn his attention to the cause of the complaint. If the cause is in the past, looking backward at it may not undo its damage. If the offending person is inaccessible or intransigent, the best therapeutic approach may be elsewhere. From the standpoint of the psychology of personal constructs, psychological disorders can be traced to the characteristics of a person's construction system. There may be other bases of explanation, but this is the one that seems most profitable. If such an explanation will adequately cover the fact, we shall at last have arrived at a vantage point from which the treatment of psychological disorders may be seen as plausible. One can do something about a person's construction system. On the other hand, if we are bound to explain disorders in terms of the past, treatment can be accomplished only by turning the clock back or tediously cancelling out each old experience and overlaying it with a new one. Another way of emphasizing the same point, although it may be an oversimplification, is to say that man may not now choose his past, but he may select his future. If we concern ourselves with his past, it is because, and only because, the way he has been behaving is often a rough guide to how he has been approaching his future. It is often a good idea to see what particular kind of mischief he has been up to. While the psychology of personal constructs has little of the scope of a philosophical religious system, there are in a few instances interesting points of congruency, such as this one. So what Kelly's saying here is the past is relevant. It's not irrelevant. It may be very useful to help us try and understand, but what we're trying to understand is where people are trying to get to, where they're going, rather than where they've been. Obviously, where they've been will make a difference to the way they see the world, and that might affect where they try to get to in their life and the way that they operate. However, just looking at the past without considering what they're going to take into their future and whether they're equipped to deal with the life that they have means that you're stuck. You can only look backwards and you can only analyse things. And Kelly was very different from that. He was early in saying, this is all about the future. We're trying to help people move on. We're not necessarily always having to look at what's happened before. Now, solution focused therapy has taken that part of PCP and made it into a whole thing. And I find some of the techniques of solution focus really useful. But actually, you've got to remember that they've come from a PCP understanding of people, so that people are trying to move on with their lives, and the frustrations that they experience and the difficulties they have are often related to not being able to get to where they want to go. So Kelly says, we prefer to construe people propositionally rather than preemptively. And if you remember, propositionally means that there is all kinds of possibilities, that a person who is old can also be a genius, can also be bad-tempered, can also be a gardener, anything. So we're not limiting people, which preemptive construing does. For the purposes of convenience, we have no objection to construing groupings of people in a constellatory manner. For example, by occupational, socio-economic, or even ratio-cultural groups, although we recognise in such stereotyping the danger of constrictive thinking about individuals who are perceived as members of the artificial groupings. So, those groupings are not real things. They're kind of a template that we apply as society on top of individuals, and we assign them to those groups. So they're rather categorical. Often we get around that by saying, assign yourself to this group. You decide which group you fit into on this form, or you can prefer not to say. In the end, the way that data is analysed will be including the racial groups that people choose. And that has been so important because we've discovered that people have been stereotyped and their opportunities have been reduced because they are seen as part of a particular group. So there is a strong argument for including that information. But when you're dealing with an individual, it is not just the stereotype. And that's the bit that we need to be really, really careful of. Don't assume that because somebody tells you they're a particular religion, that they practice it in the way that you might read about in a textbook. You want to know what it means to them and how it plays out in their life. And Kelly goes on to say, for example, it is often considered the mark of a sophisticated clinician that he considers all of his clients in terms of the cultural groups to which they belong. Yet in the final analysis, a client who is to be genuinely understood should never be confined to the stereotype of his culture. For the clinician, the cultural approach should never be more than a preliminary step in understanding his client, the first in a series of approximations which bring the client into sharp focus in a complex matrix of basic psychological dimensions. We feel pretty much the same about the commonly used and frequently used nosological categories of neuropsychiatric disorders. To start out by describing a client to a fellow clinician as schizoid is pardonable, but for the therapist to continue thinking of his client primarily as schizophrenic is unprofessional. No client should continue looking like a stereotype to an alert therapist who works with him day after day. For the most part, it is misleading to think of a disorder solely in terms of a disease entity. That makes one dependent upon a published catalogue of disorders. If a client's construction does not fit one of the official categories, his actual difficulties are likely to be ignored. And this is a problem that I think is inherent in the diagnostic system. That psychological distress can be ignored or pushed away from services. So one of the things that can often happen in child and adolescent services is people construe children's behaviour problems as not being part of what the service can offer help with. If we think of behaviour as a form of communication, that changes that completely. However, helping people with, for instance, anger is not necessarily a common thing that is offered within mental health services. I don't understand why that is, because I would think that for society, helping people with anger is one of the most important things that we can do. Incidentally, there's a new book coming out from Diane Allen and Peter Cummins, Interpreting Anger. So it's a beginner's guide to interpreting anger in personal construct psychology. That's coming out very soon, and there will be a session on our Coventry Constructivist Centre CPD programme looking at this book with Diane and Peter. Kelly goes on to say, what is a disorder? It is not explained simply by the inevitable outcome of any past which happens to be unfortunate. It relates to one's present stance as one faces the future. It is not a conventionalised category. It should be construed propositionally rather than preemptively or constellatorily. It makes no sense to try to define it as either the absence of structure or as unorthodoxy. Rather than attempt to give such a categorical definition, we have suggested simply that it represents any structure which appears to fail to accomplish its purpose. This is an extremely flexible definition. Appears to whom? What purpose is its purpose? What is failure? The answers are anybody, anybody's, and whatever you like. In other words, we are content to let disorder mean whatever is ineffectual from the point of view of the client, from the viewpoint of his therapist, from the viewpoint of his stuffy neighbours, from the viewpoint of history, or from the viewpoint of God. Perhaps the proper question is not what is a disorder, but where. And the therapist's question is not who needs treatment, but what needs treatment. Only we must keep in mind that we are working with the definition that is both provincial and heuristic. And now let us stop worrying about it. One of the things then with this is it's a really different way of thinking about disorder. So it's thinking that if there is such a thing as a construct system and it works to help us to anticipate the future, then the disorder lies within the way that construing system doesn't help us to get there. It doesn't help us to approach our future in a way that is comfortable, that allows us to be the kind of person that we want to be, or that makes us feel that there is life ahead which is going to suit us. I think diagnosis can lead to people being criticised if we're not careful, so that all of their behaviour is viewed as related to that diagnosis. So with this kind of definition, Kelly gets around the issue of the static nature of a psychiatric diagnosis. With a physical diagnosis, we expect people to get better. It's great if somebody is diagnosed as pre-diabetic, changes their diet, and then they're no longer diabetic. And on their forms at the doctors, it will no longer say that they're diabetic. I think that's very different from a psychiatric diagnosis, where it is expected that people might hang on to that diagnosis for a lot longer, and often in spite of treatment. So it's maybe a different thing. A mental health diagnosis is a different nature. I find in working with people that the diagnosis that they arrive with does not necessarily offer me a great deal of guidance for what I'm going to do. It might help as a starting point for understanding whether that person likes that diagnosis, has found it helpful, feels that it fits with them, defines themselves by it or not. But it doesn't do anything for telling me what I'm going to do, because any kind of therapeutic support is going to be entirely individual and it won't be related to the diagnosis. I might use some shorthands that I would check out. So, for instance, if I was working with a young person, maybe an 8-year-old who's got a diagnosis of autism, the useful thing about that is perhaps they're more likely to have an intense interest, but maybe not. If they've got an intense interest, it might be something that I can use in the way that I talk to them. I wonder what would happen if nobody knew the diagnosis that the system had applied to them in terms of mental health diagnoses. I wonder what sense people would make of it, and I wonder when they turned up for therapeutic interventions, what would happen? Would it make a difference that was helpful or unhelpful to the world of therapy? I don't mean the world of PCP therapy, because we don't particularly need those diagnoses. We can get on with it. It can help us to work a bit quicker if we've got some understanding that they've been through some kind of a process and other people have noticed these patterns in their behaviour. Other than that, I don't know how helpful it would be, but if we took them all away, I wonder what that would be like. It would be a delight in many respects, because then we would have to have people turn up for their appointments and everyone would start by saying, "So what's brought you here?" rather than jumping to conclusions about it. And I think that in itself would be extremely useful. So I will put the references that I mentioned in the show notes, and it'd be great if maybe you can have a listen to that radio program and see what you make of it. Okay, I will see you again at the end of April. Thanks very much for listening. Bye.